Stand on a beach in Southern California or on the shore of the Pacific in Baja, and you are about as far from the Colorado River as you can get and still be in its watershed of dependence. The great river rises in the Rocky Mountains, hundreds of miles inland, and winds its way through the deserts of the Southwest, and you might think that the cities of the coast, perched beside the vast Pacific Ocean, would have nothing to do with it. But that assumption would be profoundly wrong. Some of the largest coastal cities of the region depend, for a substantial and in some cases enormous share of their water, on the Colorado River, its water lifted and then carried across the desert through great aqueducts to reach the sea. And so, in a cruel irony, cities that sit beside the largest body of water on Earth, the Pacific Ocean, whose salt water they cannot drink, depend for their survival on a shrinking river reaching them from far inland. If the Colorado River were to die, if its decline reached the point where it could no longer deliver water to the coast, there are specific coastal cities that would find themselves in the gravest and earliest trouble. This is the story of those three coastal cities, of how a desert river came to sustain the shores of the Pacific, and of what would happen to the coast if the river that reaches it from across the desert finally failed. The river that reaches the sea. To understand how coastal cities came to depend on the Colorado River, you first have to understand the extraordinary engineering that carries the river's water across the desert to the coast, because it is one of the great feats of water infrastructure in the world. The Colorado River does not naturally flow to the coastal cities of Southern California. Its natural course carries it toward the Gulf of California, far to the south. To bring its water to the coastal plain where the great cities of the region grew, engineers built enormous aqueducts, vast channels, tunnels, and pipelines that lift the river's water and carry it across the desert and over the mountains to the coast. These aqueducts are marvels of construction, moving immense quantities of water across hundreds of miles of harsh terrain, the arteries through which the Colorado River sustains the coast. The most important of these for the coastal cities is the great aqueduct system that draws water from the Colorado at the river and carries it westward across the desert to the coastal plain of Southern California, delivering it to a regional water agency that then distributes it to the cities and communities of the coast. This system is what allows the Colorado River, a desert river, to become a lifeline for the Pacific coast, its water traveling from the arid interior to the crowded shores where millions of people live. Alongside it, other infrastructure carries Colorado River water to communities across the border in Mexico as well, extending the river's reach all the way to the coastal cities of Baja California. The result is that the Colorado River, though it never naturally touches the coast, has become one of the foundations of coastal life across a vast stretch of the region, its water pumped and channeled to the sea to sustain the cities that grew there. This engineering binds the fate of the coastal cities to the fate of the distant river. And it is why the river's decline is a threat that reaches all the way to the shore. The twist of living by the ocean there is a profound and painful irony at the heart of this story, one that must be understood to grasp the vulnerability of the coastal cities, and it is this: living beside the ocean does not solve the water problem, because the ocean is saltwater, undrinkable and unusable for most purposes without expensive treatment. The great cities of the coast sit beside the largest reservoir imaginable, the Pacific Ocean, and yet they cannot simply drink from it. Salt water is toxic to humans and useless for most purposes, and turning it into fresh water through desalination is expensive, energy-intensive, and limited in scale. So the coastal cities, for all their proximity to endless water, must import their fresh water from elsewhere, and for many of them, the Colorado River is a crucial part of that imported supply. This is the twist that makes the coastal cities so vulnerable. One might assume that a city beside the ocean would be immune to a river's decline, secure in its proximity to water. But the opposite is true. The coastal cities have little fresh water of their own, situated as they are in a naturally dry region with limited local supplies. And they have grown into vast metropolises far beyond what their local water could support. To do so, they reached out across the desert and the mountains to bring in water from distant sources, and the Colorado River became one of the most important of those sources. So the coastal cities are in a sense doubly dependent because they have little water of their own, and dependent specifically on distant rivers like the Colorado to make up the difference. The ocean at their doorstep offers no easy escape, because the cost and limits of desalination mean it cannot readily replace the imported river water on which the cities rely. This is why the death of the Colorado River would be so devastating to the coast. The cities beside the ocean cannot simply turn to the sea, and the loss of the river would strike at a supply they cannot easily replace. The first city, San Diego, at the front of the line among the coastal cities, stands San Diego, and its position there is a matter of its particularly heavy historical dependence on imported water, of which the Colorado River has been a crucial component. San Diego, one of the largest cities in the country, sits in the far southwestern corner of the region, in a naturally dry coastal environment with very limited local water resources of its own. To sustain its large population, San Diego has long depended overwhelmingly on imported water, brought in from distant sources, and for much of its history, it has been among the most import-dependent major cities in the region, with a large share of that imported water originating from the Colorado River. This heavy dependence on imported water, and specifically on the Colorado, is what places San Diego at the front of the line of vulnerability. A city that relies so heavily on water brought in from outside, with little local supply to fall back on, is acutely exposed to any threat to those imported sources, and the decline of the Colorado River strikes directly at a foundation of San Diego's water supply. If the Colorado River were to die, San Diego would face the loss of a major portion of the water on which its existence depends, with limited local resources to compensate. The city has recognized this vulnerability and worked hard to reduce it, pursuing diversification through various means, investing in water recycling, in conservation, and notably in desalination, building a major seawater desalination plant to turn some of the Pacific saltwater into fresh and reduce its dependence on imported supplies. These efforts have made San Diego more resilient than it once was, a genuine and important response to its exposure. But desalination and recycling, while valuable, remain a partial solution, expensive and limited in the share of the total supply they can provide, and San Diego remains substantially dependent on imported water, including from the Colorado. Its place at the front of the line reflects its deep historical reliance on the very water that the river's death would take away, and its position as perhaps the coastal city most exposed to the loss of the distant river. The second city, Los Angeles, the second coastal city in the path, is Los Angeles, the great metropolis of Southern California. And while its situation differs from San Diego's in important ways, it too depends on the Colorado River for a meaningful portion of its water and would be significantly affected by the river's death. Los Angeles is an enormous city, the anchor of one of the largest metropolitan regions in the world, and its water supply is famously complex. Drawn from multiple distant sources through a network of great aqueducts that made the city's growth possible. Among those sources is the Colorado River, which contributes to the vast supply that sustains the Los Angeles region. Los Angeles is, in one respect, somewhat less exposed than San Diego, because its water supply is more diversified, drawn not only from the Colorado, but from other distant sources as well. The water it brings from the eastern Sierra Nevada through its own great aqueduct, and the water it receives from Northern California through the state's water delivery system, along with local groundwater and growing efforts at recycling and conservation. This diversification means that Los Angeles does not depend on the Colorado to the same overwhelming degree that San Diego historically has, and the loss of the river would not strike quite as singularly at its supply. But this should not be mistaken for safety, because the Colorado still provides an important share of the water for the Los Angeles region, and its loss would be a serious blow, removing a major source from a supply that is already stretched to sustain an enormous population in a dry land. Moreover, the other sources on which Los Angeles depends face their own pressures and uncertainties, so that the loss of the Colorado would fall on a system that is by no means secure in its alternatives. The great size of Los Angeles means that even a partial loss of supply affects an immense number of people, and the removal of the Colorado's contribution would force the region to lean harder on its other sources, all of which have their own limits. Los Angeles earns its place among the coastal cities that would run dry first, not because it depends on the Colorado as singularly as San Diego, but because it is so enormous, because the Colorado is a real and important part of its supply, and because its alternatives are themselves under strain. The third city, Tijuana, the third coastal city in the path, takes us across the international border into Mexico, to Tijuana, the large Mexican city on the Pacific coast just south of San Diego, because the Colorado River sustains not only the American coast, but the Mexican coast as well, and Tijuana is heavily dependent on the river's water. Mexico receives a share of the Colorado River under long-standing agreements between the two countries, and much of the water that reaches the Mexican side of the border, including the water that supplies the coastal city of Tijuana, comes from the Colorado. Tijuana, a large and rapidly growing city, sits in the same dry coastal environment as its American neighbor, with limited local water of its own, and it depends heavily on the Colorado River water delivered to it across the border region. Tijuana's inclusion reflects the international reach of the Colorado River's importance, and the particular vulnerability of a city that depends so heavily on the river while having limited alternatives. Tijuana relies on the Colorado for a very large share of its water supply, making it one of the most Colorado-dependent cities anywhere, and it has fewer resources than its wealthier American neighbors to invest in the expensive alternatives like large-scale desalination that might reduce that dependence. This combination, heavy reliance on the Colorado and limited means to develop alternatives, makes Tijuana acutely exposed to the river's decline. If the Colorado River were to die, Tijuana would face the loss of the great majority of its water supply, a catastrophic prospect for a large and growing city with few other options, one already facing water stress and the challenges of supplying a rapidly expanding population. Tijuana's place among the three coastal cities is a reminder that the Colorado River's reach and the vulnerability it creates do not stop at the border, that the river sustains coastal cities in two countries, and that the Mexican coast, with its heavy dependence and limited alternatives, may be among the most exposed of all to the river's death. What running dry would really mean. Having identified the three coastal cities, it is important to be clear and honest about what the death of the Colorado River would actually mean for them, because the phrase run dry is dramatic, and the reality, while severe, is more complex than the image of taps suddenly ceasing to flow. If the Colorado River were to die, to decline to the point where it could no longer deliver water to the coast, these cities would not instantly go waterless, their taps running dry overnight. Each of them draws water from more than one source, and each has been working, to varying degrees, to diversify its supply and build resilience. The loss of the Colorado would be a severe subtraction from their water supplies, but not, in most cases, an instantaneous and total cutoff. What it would mean, rather, is a profound crisis of supply, a loss so large that it would force drastic measures and impose serious hardship. For a city like San Diego or Tijuana, heavily dependent on the Colorado, the loss of the river would remove a major portion of the water on which the city depends, forcing severe restrictions, emergency measures, and a desperate scramble to find alternatives. For a more diversified city like Los Angeles, the loss would be serious, but somewhat more absorbable, forcing greater reliance on other sources that are themselves stretched. In all cases, the death of the river would mean water shortages, restrictions, rising costs, and the difficult work of trying to replace an irreplaceable source. It would mean rationing, the tearing out of lawns, the halting of growth, the painful reallocation of scarce water among competing needs. It would strike hardest at those with the fewest alternatives. The cities would not vanish, but they would be forced into a new and far harder relationship with water, one of scarcity and struggle, and the comfortable abundance that the imported river water made possible would be gone. This is what running dry would really mean, not necessarily the instant cessation of all water, but the loss of a foundational source that would plunge the coastal cities into a crisis of scarcity from which there would be no easy escape. Why the river is dying. To understand the threat to the coastal cities, one must understand why the Colorado River is in such peril, because the river's decline is the root of the danger, and it is a decline driven by powerful forces that show no sign of relenting. The Colorado River has been overused for a very long time. Its water promised to more users than the river actually carries. A structural imbalance built into the way the river was divided among the states and nations that depend on it. This overallocation was baked in from the beginning, based on estimates of the river's flow made during an unusually wet period, so that the river was divided as though it carried more water than it truly does. For decades, this imbalance was hidden by drawing down the reservoirs, but that cannot continue forever. Layered on top of the overallocation is the drought and the warming climate that have gripped the region for years, reducing the river's flow still further. The warming pulls moisture from the snowpack and the soil, diminishing the runoff that feeds the river, so that even the water the river once reliably carried is shrinking. The great reservoirs that store the river's water have fallen toward critically low levels, and the whole system has been pushed toward crisis. This is what it means to speak of the Colorado River dying, not that it would vanish entirely, but that it could decline to the point where it can no longer meet the demands placed upon it, where the water available falls so far short of what is needed that the deliveries to users, including the distant coastal cities, are deeply cut or cannot be sustained. The forces driving this decline, the overallocation and the warming, drying climate, are deep and persistent, which is why the threat to the river and to the coastal cities that depend on it is so serious and so enduring. The river is dying not from any single cause, but from the accumulated weight of too much demand and too little water. The race to replace the river. Faced with the threat to the Colorado River, the coastal cities have not stood still, and their efforts to reduce their dependence on the river represent a crucial part of the story, a race to build alternatives before the river fails. These efforts vary from city to city, shaped by each place's resources and circumstances. But together, they illustrate both the possibilities and the limits of trying to replace a foundational water source. Understanding them is essential to grasping the true situation of the coastal cities, which is neither hopeless nor secure, but somewhere in between, defined by an ongoing struggle to diversify away from a threatened river. The most prominent of these efforts is desalination, the turning of seawater into fresh water, which holds a special appeal for coastal cities sitting beside the ocean. Desalination offers the tantalizing promise of a local, drought-proof source drawn from the endless Pacific, and some coastal cities have invested in it, building plants to convert saltwater into fresh. But desalination is expensive, consuming large amounts of energy and money, and the water it produces costs far more than the imported river water it would replace. It also raises environmental concerns, from its energy use to the disposal of the concentrated salt brine left behind. For these reasons, desalination has grown but remains a limited part of the overall supply, able to reduce dependence on the river, but not, so far, to replace it wholesale. Alongside desalination, the coastal cities have pursued water recycling, treating wastewater to a high standard so that it can be reused, a promising approach that is expanding but that also has limits and costs. And they have pursued conservation, reducing demand through efficiency, the tearing out of thirsty lawns, and changes in how water is used, which has proven powerful but which can only stretch a supply so far. Together, these efforts are making the coastal cities more resilient, chipping away at their dependence on the Colorado and building alternatives against the day the river might fail. But the hard truth is that no combination of these measures has yet been able to fully replace the enormous quantity of water the Colorado provides, and the cities remain, for now, substantially dependent on the threatened river even as they race to change that. The race to replace the river is real and important, but it is not yet won. The deeper lesson of the coast steps back from the specific fate of the three coastal cities, and the story reveals a profound lesson about the hidden connections that sustain modern life and the vulnerabilities they create, a lesson that reaches far beyond these particular cities. The lesson is that the great coastal metropolises, for all their apparent modernity and wealth and their proximity to the ocean, rest on foundations that stretch far inland, drawing their very water from distant rivers across deserts and mountains, and that these hidden connections make them vulnerable to threats that seem, at first glance, to have nothing to do with the coast. Most residents of these cities have little idea that their water comes in part from a river hundreds of miles away, a river now in serious decline, and this invisibility is part of the danger, because a threat that is not seen is a threat that is not prepared for. The coastal cities are a vivid illustration of the interconnectedness and the fragility of the systems that sustain modern civilization. A city beside the ocean would seem to be the last place to worry about a river dying in the desert, and yet the death of that river would strike at the heart of the coastal city's existence. This reveals how the security of even the most seemingly secure places depends on distant and often unseen foundations, and how the failure of those foundations can reach across vast distances to threaten places that appear entirely disconnected from the danger. The Colorado River and the coastal cities it sustains are bound together by the great aqueducts, and by the deeper reality that a dry region cannot support great cities without reaching far beyond itself for water. As the river declines, that reaching becomes ever more precarious. The deeper lesson is one of humility and interconnection, that the water which sustains the coast comes from afar, that its source is now threatened, and that the comfortable assumption of endless water, like the river itself, cannot be taken for granted. The warning from the water in the end, the story of the Colorado River and the 3 coastal cities that would run dry first, is a warning, a reminder of the precariousness that underlies the abundance of the modern coastal metropolis, and a call to confront the reality of a shrinking river before its decline forces the confrontation on far harsher terms. San Diego, Los Angeles, and Tijuana, 3 great cities of the Pacific coast, in 2 countries, sustained in part by a desert river reaching them from across the mountains and the sands, stand as illustrations of a vulnerability that few of their residents fully appreciate, a dependence on a distant and dying river that could, in its worst decline, plunge them into crisis. Their inclusion on this list reflects the hard realities of their water supplies. San Diego's deep historical dependence on imported water, the enormous scale of Los Angeles, and the real contribution the Colorado makes to its supply, and Tijuana's heavy reliance on the river with limited means to find alternatives. None of this means catastrophe is inevitable. The coastal cities are working to diversify. The states and nations that share the Colorado are struggling to manage its decline, and the river's fate is not yet sealed, dependent still on the choices the region makes and the weather the mountains deliver. But the warning is clear. The coastal cities cannot take their water for granted, cannot assume that the river which has sustained them will continue to do so, and cannot afford to ignore the deep vulnerability their dependence on the distant Colorado creates. The race to build alternatives, to conserve, to recycle, to draw carefully on the ocean is a race against the decline of the river, and its outcome will shape the future of the coast. For now, the water still flows from the Colorado to the coast, across the great aqueducts, sustaining the cities beside the sea. But the river is dying, slowly, under the weight of too much demand and too little water, and the day may come when the coastal cities can no longer rely on it. When that day approaches, it will be San Diego and Los Angeles and Tijuana, the coastal cities most bound to the distant river, that feel it first. The ocean at their doorstep cannot save them, and the river that